Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're recording on Friday the 24th of May. So, hi Jen, how are things going? What have you been up to today and this week in Maritime Matters?
Hey Richard, good to be on for I think it's our fourth episode now of Maritime Matters, maybe our fifth. The fact that I can't remember means we're moving along. What have I been up to this week? So it was interesting to see the Deputy Commander Indo-PACOM out in Australia and speaking at the press clubs. Lucky enough to snag a ticket along to that for a free lunch and a good speech. So thinking a little bit about the Australia-US alliance. I also have a piece that I'm working on that should be out next week, hopefully in the AFR, talking about the 20-year anniversary since the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Defence, Defence and Trade, so our Joint Standing Committee, undertook an inquiry into Australia's maritime strategy. So the anniversary of that being tabled was actually the 21st of June, 2024, 20 years on. And it's interesting to look through the recommendations because most of them have never been enacted. So I've got a piece coming out talking about that next week. What have you been up to?
Shock horror. I've been sort of plugging away. As I think we were just talking about before we came on air, I was just finished a lecture on Hunter class, which is always fun and games to be talking about that sort of thing. But no, the thing that I thought was interesting is I've just started a new book looking at navalism of all concepts and going right back, looking at navalism in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is it talks a lot about the connections between journalists, naval officers and politicians and the interconnections between them and how naval officers cultivated a lot of these links to try and promote the Navy and get the message of the Navy and why the Navy matters out to the wider public and to politicians. And I thought that was interesting, again, in today's world where I think perhaps we could take a little bit of a leaf out of the book of 19th century and early 20th century British naval officers. But anyway, I'll park that one. I wanted to ask you, what did you make of the Deputy Indo-PACOM's comments? Because there was quite a lot of press reaction to them. What did you make of his comments?
Look, he is a great speaker, and I think in Australia where we're not used to having senior defence officials talk candidly about defence issues, I think we always get excited when we have a US senior defence official come across. And to be fair, I think somebody made the comment he was the only person to give a speech at the press club and then smash a bottle of Mountain Dew. So he's quite unique, General Skolenka. Look, I thought it was interesting. Did I think there was anything new in it? No, I think it was consistent with the things that he has said before, the things we've heard from both the previous and the new Commander Indo-PACOM. So I think that was a good speech, but nothing new. I thought the interesting bit, though, was the questions that the journalists continue to ask. And there was a question, and then I saw a headline, I think, in The Guardian about General Skolenka had no view, and I think it was assumed then the US had no view on how Australia will operate its subs, where will it operate its nuclear-powered subs, and whether they commit it to a conflict. And I find it really interesting, I think, that journalists continue to ask this question. It's very clear that no defence official is ever going to say where Australia will operate its subs and how it will operate its submarines. That seems pretty obvious. Submarines are all about stealth. So I thought that was interesting. But it was a good speech, but nothing new from it.
Yeah, I think it's hopefully sooner or later we'll move away from what seems to be a kind of a desire for headline baiting, but maybe that's me being far too optimistic about journalists and us consumers of media. So moving on, we always talk about what's been happening in the region. So what's caught your eye? I can think of one particularly large story. So do you want to lead off?
Right, so the big one is obviously the Chinese exercise called Joint Sword 2024 Alpha. And they're at pains to call it 2024 Alpha, which implies that there will be a few more iterations of this. And this is effectively an exercise that's come 3 days after the inauguration of the new president of Taiwan. President Lai, and his inauguration speech, which certainly China has taken some exception to, as has their news channel, CCTV, and everybody's favorite cartoon channel, the Global Times. There is a view that this exercise, which is really encircling Taiwan, aims to send a message post the inauguration speech and is in response to that. Of course, it's not in response to the inauguration speech, because we know that these joint exercises, that the reports are, it includes, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and the Rocket Force, so all arms of PLA, would take months to plan. So this has been scheduled for a while, but clearly to be very close to the inauguration speech. I think the exercise itself is interesting in terms of the areas they're covering. It's not necessarily the biggest one they've ever done. There is some debate about that, whether the one in 2022 in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit was bigger. But this one is a little bit unique in terms of the Chinese militaries of the PLA have pushed out a diagram which shows where they're exercising, and they're at pains to message that they are exercising around all of the offshore islands from Taiwan, so Kinmen, Matsu, and that they have significant representation of Taiwan's Pacific coast, which we did see in the 2023 iteration of Joint Sword, but this seems to be more detailed. And I think the thing that makes this exercise interesting, not just the scale and the breadth of it, including the offshore islands, as I mentioned, but also the rhetoric around it. So there has been releases from the PLA and also the government spokespeople saying that this is about teaching a message to the Taiwan separatists. And that really references something that China has referred to President Lai as many times, in fact, before he was elected and post his election, as a separatist. I don't think there's anything in his speeches that he's given since his election or his inauguration speech that shows he's a separatist, but they've certainly taken issue with the way he referred to China in his inauguration speech, and interpreting an implication that it referred to China as a separate country. So, significant development. Is it surprising? No, most people predicted that there was going to be a major exercise around this time, but still of interest. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so I again, this is, in some ways, it seems so sort of choreographed and clearly fitting in with a sort of a wider picture of what has been going on for some time. I was quite surprised by the strength of some of the rhetoric that came out so quickly, particularly the line around punishment, which, again, coming from a PLA spokesperson, it seemed to me, and I am not a China expert by any means, but it seemed to be that little bit of a step up, a firmer language, and again, the even more kind of explicit elements of some of the details of what they're going to do. It seemed to me, as I say, to be something of a kind of a step up. Whether or not we'll see anything that kind of comes from it, and precisely how long this lasts for, and whether we see some of the kind of the extra bits and pieces that we saw after the exercises around Nancy Pelosi's visit, I think we'll just have to wait and see. But it's clearly something that is going to continue, and it's a lever that the PRC think that they have, and that they will continue to pull whenever they feel it appropriate.
Absolutely, and I think it was announced yesterday it might be a 2-day exercise, but I think the interesting thing is when you look back over the last couple of years. So, yes, this is consistent with 2022 reactions to Nancy Pelosi's visit, consistent with the exercise in 2023. Each time they seem to evolve a little bit, but if you go back 4 years, this is quite significant. If you measured it from the baseline then in terms of the types of exercises China would do around the Taiwan Strait, we saw this in 2023, but the encompassing of the Pacific coast of Taiwan is interesting and certainly sends a message. And you're right in terms of the rhetoric too. There was some very, very strong rhetoric that came aligned with this. So as much as this is not a huge change on the 2023 iteration, or it doesn't look like it is a significant change to status quo when you go back about 4 years. And I think we're going to talk later on about median line and 80s incursions and what that means and the changes we're seeing in that.
Yeah, I think you could to a degree frame this within the boiling the frog analogy that we've talked about before, about establishing a kind of a new normal, and the degree to which we can now sit here and say, oh, this isn't that surprising. As you say, if you look back more than a couple of years, this is a really significant kind of step up, and I think you can see that playing out in a number of areas, and this is one of them.
I completely agree. So what else has been happening this week, Richard?
So if we talk capability, it's normally where I immediately go to, right?
Yep.
So one of the things that I thought was interesting was the announcement by the South Australian government with quite a lot of fanfare about the fact that they have a deal with Huntington Ingalls Industries, who are obviously massive American shipbuilder. In this case, most important, sort of framed as one of the two builders of American nuclear submarines. And the deal is supposedly to get South Australian firms into the American submarine supply chain. On paper, this looks like a great move. It certainly fits into a lot of the wider framing around AUKUS, and I think you can see potentially some real advantages if we can begin to see integration between the industrial bases in the three countries and sort of shared industrial bases to try and overcome some of the supply chain issues. But also, if we're thinking about stuff like the ability of Australia to provide maintenance for both Australian submarines down the line, but also American submarines rotating through Surf West, so the force rotated in and out of the west coast of Australia. This type of thing makes a huge amount of sense. It also has the potential to drive up skilled workers and provide, because of if you get into the American industrial base, the level of demand is that much higher, and so you can look at providing a kind of a continuing workflow to have secure jobs, secure industry and demand. So lots and lots of things that potentially could be good. But as I think you were commenting only just before we came on air here, there's a lot of potential and look at within this announcement. Peter Malinowskis, the Premier, is currently doing the rounds in the United States, clearly kind of spruiking South Australia with a big AUKUS focus. I think it sounds great. What actually happens, I'm a little bit more skeptical, but then I am ever a cynic, so you can tell me I'm too cynical.
No, look, you probably are rightfully so. I guess when I think about AUKUS, I'm always glass half full, because that's kind of where I think we need to be as a nation. You know, I do think we need to believe in ourselves a little bit more when it comes to defence capability. Now, I know that you go, hey, I just delivered a lecture on the Hunter class procurement, and that's probably an easy way to counter that argument. But I do think that it is positive to see we're having these conversations.
What else has been going on in the world of capability this week? Some significant updates in terms of the RAN fleet.
Right, and now there are 10, right? 10 surface combatants. Look, it would be remiss of us not to mention HMAS Anzac decommissioning on the 18th of May. You know, Anzac has had a pretty significant career. Certainly commissioned in 1996 and has been run hard pretty since. You know, in the 2019 ANAO audit that talked about the Anzacs really highlighted that deployments to the Southern Ocean, which I think Anzac's first deployment might have been to the Southern Ocean, really did give those vessels a hard run. Obviously, in our kind of recent naval history, she's fairly significant for the Battle of Our and her engagement of naval gunfire support to the Our Peninsula. So pretty, I guess, a pretty well thought of and well regarded ship. I never had the joy of serving in Anzac, but deployed with her multiple times. So it is sad to see her go. And it is sad from a perspective of the decrease in the size of the Royal Australian Navy, right? Like we got all excited in February when we heard about the doubling of the surface combatant fleet. I still maintain the line, it's not doubling because you can't count the large optionally crewed surface vessels as surface combatants, I would say, at this stage. But either way, it is a significant increase. But, you know, we often tend to gloss over the fact that we're seeing a decrease, so we will see, obviously, Anzac's now been decommissioned, although, to be fair, she has not been operational for a while. I think they had to take her off the hard stand and put her in the water to decommission her. And Hunter is being decommissioned in 2026. So we're going from 11 down to 9 in 2026 before that starts to increase in the late 20s, fingers crossed, or the early 30s. And it just goes to show that despite the fact that the IIP that was recently released, the Integrated Investment Program, says that over the next 10 years, 38% of investment is going into the maritime domain, we do have, and this might be a controversial comment, but I stand by it, relatively one of the least capable navies that we have had in our history, or certainly in the last 50 years. So it is sobering. I see that you disagree with that. ABC, you're doing a fact check on that, by the way. Keep an eye out for that.
Excellent.
But yeah, what do you think? Farewell, Anzac. What's your comments?
I think it's clearly a very significant vessel in Australia's recent naval history. Something kind of a sort of an emblem in many ways of the Royal Australian Navy throughout the kind of the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. Served in the Middle East with distinction. So yeah, really kind of significant platform. And part of kind of the wider story, I think that there's a really interesting story that doesn't necessarily always get enough attention of, to my mind, I think in some ways the kind of the running down of the RAN in the sort of the 1990s and 2000s, where what were tier 2 vessels end up having to be kind of upgraded into tier 1.5 vessels to try and eke out a reasonable sized fleet. So that would be where I would kind of potentially question your least capable RAN. I think the quality gap between something like a Hobart and when we were running around with a bunch of modified FFGs.
Don't you dare ship after my own heart.
We can take that one offline, maybe.
It's a fair point, but it's that quality versus quantity debate as well, I guess.
Absolutely. Any one ship can only be in one place at one time, right? Mm-hmm. And if you've only got 3 of them, how many are you actually going to have in commission or on operation? So,
let alone when you're pushing them through an upgrade of their combat system.
Real questions about a lot of this. And Anzac's, of course, not the only one, is she? Huon also is on the way out soon.
Yeah, sad to see another one of the Huon class mine hunters go. So originally we had 8. We decommissioned a couple, I think around 2018. Norman and Hawkesbury were their names. And now we have 6. So Huon is decommissioning on the 30th of May. Haven't seen a lot about it. We did obviously hear this when the NDS was launched. The Defence Minister, Pat Conroy, also announced that one of the offsets to fund a lot of the new capabilities would be the decommissioning of the MCMs. It's still not clear what is replacing that capability in the RAN order of battle. Certainly there has been some stuff put out that it'll be replaced with autonomous capabilities, and I think we've talked about this before, but from a port clearance perspective, that makes a whole lot of sense. I do wonder how that goes in terms of clearing things like the Torres Strait or expeditionary operations, but certainly they're working on a concept of operations there. What's your take on saying goodbye to Huon?
I mean, it's difficult to really know a lot of what's going on in the MCM kind of space at the moment because you hear such divergent things about the capabilities and reliability of this the kind of complete autonomous uncrewed system sort of modules that is the kind of the broad approach. Certainly if you look at someone like the RN, they're also going down the same kind of line. Operating off vessels of opportunity. So if everything works, then you can see the logic. I remain slightly skeptical about how well everything works, considering that this has been something that's been coming for a very long time, right? It's been a year or so away for at least 10 years.
Yeah.
So again, this is maybe the skeptic in me about the sort of true maturity of a lot of this autonomous technology. I also, and this is sort of falling back on my kind of historical basis of somebody who's recently been looking very much at the take-up of vessels from trade and things like this, this reliance on vessels of opportunity there aren't very many vessels of opportunity.
I'm glad you said that.
And there are going to be an awful lot of demands on these things. Yes, you can say, okay, there are platforms that are being used in the offshore hydrocarbons industry that we can use, but we've not got very many of them, and they're going to be wanted to do a whole host of different things. Not having a dedicated hull, I think, it's a concern.
So I'm glad you said that, right? Because I mentioned before that we are almost approaching the 20-year anniversary of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. They're reporting to maritime strategy, right? We're almost at 20 years. So 2 of their recommendations actually related to our merchant shipping capability. So one was Defence clearly articulating what support they would need in the event of a conflict from the merchant industry, which I'm not sure we're there. And the other one was Australia being really clear about its policy and pursuing that. And although we had the recent report into the strategic maritime capability and all those recommendations, it's not clear that that's actually moved. So back to that recommendations thing, vessels of opportunity, to have those in place requires a degree of planning that I'm not sure we're there.
Yep, absolutely.
But glass half full, we might be.
In terms of other things that have been happening in capability?
Collins LOTE. So Collins life of type upgrade, life of type extension. So there was a report in the Australian this week, or an article in the Australian this week, that a report had been leaked and that a US or previous US government official had been commissioned to do a report into the viability of the Collins LOTE. Right, and the Collins LOTE has been around a little while. It's about extending the Collins until we get our new Virginia-class capability. And the intent really is to cut the hull in half and replace a bunch of the insides. Now, exactly what is being replaced internally isn't clear. There's clearly some stuff around propulsion, but there's been discussion about insertion of Tomahawk, etc. There's not really a clear list. But basically, the news this week said, hey, this is a high-risk program. But I don't think we really needed the report to be leaked to tell us it's a high-risk program. Of course, it is a high-risk program. So that's kind of my take on it. There was some more stuff in that. I'm being a little bit flippant. There was some stuff about making sure that that Australia engages further with the original designers of the Collins class, and whether Australia has the expertise currently to be able to achieve this. But look, I didn't think there was a lot new in it. I think that it's not clear what's happening with the Collins LOTE. We know it needs to happen. Are they doing it to all 6 boats? What are they replacing? What capability are they putting inside? Really, it's a stopgap just to get us to phase 2 of AUKUS Pillar 1. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a slightly different view in the regard. I broadly agree with you that the report, such as we got the report on the report, doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't know. But I think that it's important in the regard that in terms of the wider public perception, we hear a lot about AUKUS. We hear a lot about the risks of the Virginias not turning up. We hear quite a lot about concerns around will SSN AUKUS ever happen? Are the Brits capable? Collins LOTE is really important. And if it falls over, it will have huge implications, particularly for things like training pipelines, etc. So this is a really important project. It's also a really hard project. And in any other kind of time frame, this would be one of the big defense kind of mega projects, which everyone was paying attention to, right? And it's a $5 billion project. This is a big thing.
You're right. We used to think that was a lot until we heard $368 billion. Yep.
Nobody's talking about it at all. And the other element within this is workforce, in the regard that this is being run through the second half of the 2020s and through the 2030s, and it's being done by ASC. Well, what else are ASC doing at this time? Well, they're building Hunter, and they're preparing to build and starting to build on SSN AUKUS. Where does that leave Collins LOTE in terms of priorities? Well, I suspect probably at the bottom. And so I think there's this real concern, and so the value, I think, in this is simply reinforcing that this matters, and this is something that we need to be taking very seriously. Now, I'm sure defence already are, and inside defence there's an awareness of this.
Yeah.
But I think it's something that's important to be flagging more widely. We're going to move on and have our regular feature of Do You Know? And this week we've got a bit of a Taiwan theme, given the events that have been going on. So I'm going to firstly, very, very briefly, talk a little bit about the so-called median line, which is often discussed, and there's often been quite a lot of discussion about, and often quite heated commentary on the fact that the Chinese have been crossing the median line. And I think that in some ways that's really understandable, but it's useful to kind of take a step back and think of what the median line is before we leap to any particular conclusions on that. So the median line, and I've been trying to do some digging onto precisely the origins of the median line, and typically there are a couple of different sort of ideas or claims about this, but it originates in the mid 1950s. It's generally associated with being drawn by an American Air Force officer, Benjamin Davis, in 1954, 1955. As a way of effectively demarcating and separating off the nationalists in Taiwan and the communists in China. And at that time, certainly from an American perspective, a large part of this was actually about preventing the Taiwanese or the nationalists from doing anything that they too aggressive. So this is not necessarily viewed in quite the way that we view it now. This line has no kind of status in international law. It has, however, been broadly acknowledged and accepted by both sides for a very long time. And so that is where its significance in many ways comes from, not from a kind of a legal status, but from a customary type status. So what you're seeing when you're seeing that the Chinese, and certainly from sort of 2019 onwards, you've seen a real ramping up of crossings of the median line, and more recently, much more so. So what you're actually seeing is, in some ways, that the Chinese have the median line actually at the moment gives them a certain degree of opportunity in the regard that they can cross this line. In doing so, it's often seen as being quite an aggressive statement, and they can make a statement in doing so. But in fact, they are perfectly legally allowed to do so. Within international law, there is nothing stopping them from crossing this line. Mm-hmm. And as such, they can then sort of put pressure on the other side, particularly the Americans and others talking about the rules-based international order. They can operate in international waters and international airspace without sort of this being in any way an illegal kind of activity. So I think it's always worth just keeping that in mind when we're talking about and hearing quite a lot about the Taiwan median line.
It is, and I think too often we hear the median line and China's incursions over the median line, which are aggressive, right? They are aggressive, but it's somehow a breach of international law. Now, there are plenty of examples of, in my view, China breaching international maritime law throughout the region, but crossing the median line isn't one. But I do think it is a good measure of how the status quo is changing in terms of China's aggression towards Taiwan, because it was only the last few years where we've started to see these regular mass crosses of the median line with the military. So I've talked about the median line. The other thing we want to talk about is what is an air defense identification zone, and we're going to give you like the quick back of a fag packet explanation. But what we will do is put in the show notes a link to a really good SimSec article that does explain the history of an ADIZ. So just very briefly, an ADIZ is an air defense identification zone. It does have some standing in international law, so unlike the median line, which doesn't exist in international law, ADIZs do. But they shouldn't be assumed as something like your territorial sea, territorial airspace, your exclusive economic zone. It is really a different concept. So in the same way that under UNCLOS we have the concept of the freedom of the seas, right, which we talk about a lot, especially in Southeast Asia, pretty relevant. And it has the freedom of overflight as well. We have the same idea of the freedom of international airspace, right? And that comes from just after World War I, and you have the 1919 Paris Convention for the Regulation of Aerial Navigation. In 1944, and it talks about the concept of the freedom of the skies, so similar concept to the freedom of the seas. In 1944, you get the Convention on International Civil Aviation, the Chicago Convention, which in some ways, and international lawyers will cringe when I say this, but it is kind of equivalent to UNCLOS in international airspace, to a certain extent. Now, the Chicago Convention is the first time we actually see an ADIZ defined in international law. And I'm going to read out that definition because I think it's really helpful when you conceptualize what is an ADIZ. So Annex 15, if you want to look it up, the Chicago Convention talks about an ADIS being a special designated airspace of defined dimensions within which aircraft are required to comply with special identification and/or reporting procedures additional to those related to the provision of air traffic services. And really, it was conceptualized in terms of civil aviation, right? In the same way that you want to know what ships are coming in and out of your ports, you want to know what aircraft are coming in and out of your airspace. It doesn't apply to military aircraft or state-owned aircraft, for example. Now, since the Chicago Convention, ADIS is kind of taking on a whole new meaning from a defense perspective, right? So during the Cold War, we see the US, which is the first country to establish an ADIS. There's about 20 countries in the world now that have an ADIS, so not all countries bother with an ADIS. But the US was the first one to really emphasize an ADIS from their defense perspective, right? And obviously they were concerned about Russia's capabilities and that they wouldn't necessarily get enough warning time to be able to respond to it. So I guess move on to kind of current time, and we've seen a lot of countries in the East China Sea establish ADISs. So China obviously established an ADIS, which became quite controversial when they put it over the top of the Senkaku Islands. Taiwan has an established ADIS. In fact, it was actually established by the US in 1958 or something like that. South Korea has an ADIS, Japan has an ADIS, right? So you can see it starts to become quite congested in East Asia in terms of the ADISs. Now, we see a lot of commentators talking about China's aggression towards Taiwan, and we've talked about the current exercise in terms of violation of Taiwan's ADIS. And I think it's important to just remember what Taiwan's ADIS is. Because one, there is no reason that China can't fly aircraft into Taiwan's ADIS. It's not a zone under international law in the same way as a territorial sea, right? Certainly military aircraft, because remember the Chicago Convention doesn't apply to military aircraft. So where it defines an ADIS, it talks about civilian aircraft, and that's really kind of that airspace control perspective. The second bit to note about Taiwan's ADIS is that Taiwan's ADIS, when it was established in the 50s, actually overlaps a fair chunk of mainland China and the Fujian province, of which there are air bases. So, arguably you would say that every time a aircraft took off from one of those air bases in China, in mainland China, within their territorial airspace, it breached Taiwan's ADIS. So, the US, for example, does not recognize what is basically the western quadrant of Taiwan's ADIS beyond the median line, because that is part of China's territorial airspace. So I guess, when we talk about an ADIS, it's important to understand what an ADIS is, where it sits in international law, and the fact that when we talk about incursions into Taiwan's ADIS, it doesn't mean that China is breaching international law, and, Taiwan's ADIS is still declared over parts of mainland China, which is kind of unhelpful from that perspective.
So I think that's about all we've got time for on this episode of Maritime Matters. As you can see, as ever, lots and lots going on in the maritime domain. We'll be back next week to talk more about what is going on in Australia, in the wider Indo-Pacific and beyond in terms of maritime affairs. Until then, thanks a lot, Jen.
Thanks, Richard.